in chapter 12. And has just a very brief review. We know the children of Israel now are going to be released. As a matter of fact, as we talked last week, Pharaoh has told them it's time for them to go. And this was brought about because of the death of the firstborn. And so we find that it took something very dramatic and very harsh in our eyes to get Pharaoh to see the error of his way. And so we find that as it was told early on in the study of Exodus, the Lord told Moses, you're not going to have to worry about Pharaoh letting you go. He's going to tell you to leave. And of course, this came about in Exodus chapter 12, verse 31. And he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise up and get you from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord, as you have said. Take your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and be gone. So Pharaoh has told them, it's time for you to go, be gone. A little bit of a tidbit there. Pharaoh asked Moses to bless him. Well, you know, a lot of times, and we talked about that, people will get themselves in a tight, and this is a quick overview, if you will, and the first thing they want to do is ask for blessings of the Lord. Well, just as soon as those blessings are gone, what happens? Or just as soon as they get themselves out of the tight, what happens? Well, most of the time they revert back to the same old ways and the same old things they've always done it. So we're going to see Pharaoh, but going to be the same way. He's going to send his army, when we get to that part, after the children of Israel. So we find that here again, because of his hard-heartedness and his stubbornness and him not listening to the directions from Moses, who was acting in lieu of God, he's going to destroy his army. Truly it was said by his servants many plagues ago, you need to listen to these people and you need to let these people go because you are going to destroy Egypt. And sure enough, in the end, what did he do? Destroyed Egypt, didn't he? And the servants and people could see all this coming, but Pharaoh, being the leader he was, and thinking that he was a god himself from the sun god Ra, that he was invincible. Well, you know, it looked like it should have told him after the first 9 plagues that, Pharaoh, you're not invincible. Your gods are false gods, they're hollow gods. And so we find it has led up to the firstborn being dead. And of course, we talked about the death angel passing over the children of Israel by the death of the Paschal lamb, and that blood was put over the doorpost and the top of the door, the little post, and the death angel passed them over. And that's why it's called the Passover. And this is going to be a feast that's going to be kept throughout the history of the Israelites. It was to be kept, as we're going to see, year by year, as a memorial and a remembrance of you being set free in Egypt. Now we know the Passover ended when Jesus came and took the Passover for the last time before his death, and he instituted our Passover today, which is the Lord's Supper. It is the memorial that we have for our Paschal Lamb, Christ. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as this unfolds in these ordinances and regulations that's going to come up. And so we find in verse 43, and that's just a quick overview, and the Lord said unto Moses and Aaron, this is the ordinance of the Passover. Therefore shall no stranger eat thereof. But every man's servant that is bought for money, when he has circumcised him, then shall he eat thereof. So we're going to start to see that even the Israelites had regulations regarding the strangers and the foreigners in eating of the Passover. We're going to find that you had to be an Israelite in, well, I guess you could say in the physical, because you had to be circumcised and accept the teachings of the Hebrew people. What we would call a proselyte today, to eat the Passover. But if you was not circumcised, or you were a foreigner or stranger in the land, uncircumcised, then you can't eat the Passover. And, you know, kind of sort of the regulation today, isn't it? Even though we know a lot of times strangers and all will come amongst us, and we serve the Lord's Supper because we're not Lord's Supper police, but that's still true today. It's unrecognized in the eyes of God. basically is what we're saying here. In other words, this was recognized in the flesh by fleshly men, but is the taking of the Passover, our spiritual feast today, recognized by God, taken by those who do not are worthy to partake of it, is what I'm trying to say. This morning it looks like between my mind and my words, I can't get them synchronized, Eric. Sometimes you have that, don't you? Getting both of them to work together in harmony. So maybe we'll get it on. So it is right here that these things are becoming an ordinance for them to be followed. And notice what it says here, and this is what we just talked about. A foreigner and a hired servant shall not eat thereof. So unless you was proselyted or accepted the Jewish customs, then you were not accepted in as a Jew in the Passover. And notice what it says here, in one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry forth out of the flesh abroad out of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. So this was going to be done by a family ordinance. It was going to be done in the house. That Passover lamb would not leave that home. And you know, we stop and think about the Passover today, the Lord's Supper. Is it eaten outside the church? My point is, there are those that do it, but we find that the spirit of it is only recognized where? In the church. And the same here, it was only recognized, it was supposed to be in the church, right? Assembled together with the saints, one body and one accord. So kind of the same principle we see here in this. And so we find that this ordinance is to be done. And notice what else it says here. And all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. You know, that's a commandment, isn't it? Shall. You know, shall means written in stone. It will happen. Shall. So all of Israel is commanded to eat it. So what is the church commanded to do on the first day of the week? As an item of worship. Partake of the Lord's Supper. So the physical and the spiritual comes into play again. And there's a lot more detail that we could go into on all this. And I've got a certain amount of material I want to try to cover so we can get on into chapter 13. And when a stranger shall sojourn with thee, and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. So you see, here we're getting into accepting the Jewish culture. If you didn't accept the Jewish culture, then you didn't eat the Passover. Let all his males be circumcised, then let him come near and keep it. And he shall be as one that is born in the land, for no uncircumcised person shall eat as one. So that was the acceptance into the Jewish faith, wasn't it? Being circumcised. It recognized as a Jew. You know, very often we talk about in Acts 2 of those 17, 18 different nations mentioned there that was present there on the day of Pentecost. But very often we don't think too much about the last word at the end of those nations. What does it say? Proselytes. So what is a proselyte? A proselyte is one that has accepted and follows the Jewish faith. So there were proselytes involved in that. They were Jews in the eyes of the children of Israel and in the eyes of God. They were a part of Israel. And so we find that these regulations are given to make these people separate and distinct today. Are we circumcised today in the church? Not in the flesh, are we?
Not in the flesh, but in the heart.
There you go. It's a circumcision of the heart, isn't it? That's where the circumcision takes place today, is in the heart. And so we find that there's no longer a cutting of the flesh like it was back then. But it's in the heart. And that comes about through the hearing of the gospel, doesn't it? You know, these people had to hear the word too to accept the Jewish faith, but it was handed down. You know, they didn't have it in written form like we have it today. So the elders of Israel were duty bound to do what? If they owned foreigners and strangers in their house, or they had foreigners and strangers serving in their house, whose responsibility was it to teach these foreigners and strangers? there. So how were they going to know about the Jewish faith? You know, they could see it live, but explaining why we do these things. Kind of the same way in the church today, isn't it? What do we do to foreigners and strangers? We teach them, don't
Teacher.
we? We teach them.
Yeah, see, people say they were taught, they know that they had two ordinances, one for the born, the natural born there,
Right.
and then one for the stranger.
Right.
But they had to be told and made to understand what was going on.
Right.
This is real plain over in Numbers 9, chapter
Okay.
9.
All right.
Numbers
Okay.
has got a whole lot to say about it. And, well, it's the same thing. It's repeating here, but it seems like it's a little more in detail. I read a little of it. I think it's about like 9 and probably.
Okay. One up.
They
You want?
kept it on the 14th day of the month. And that
Right.
was the main thing. They starting out with verse 5, and then you read down there for a little while, and you'll see what's going on.
I think it picks up what you're talking about primarily in verse 10. Speaking to the children of Israel, saying, if any man among you or of your posterity shall be an unclean person that talks about a dead body. Let's see, where am I at? I think it's right on down in here where you were talking about. Verse 14. And if a stranger shall sojourn among you and will keep the Passover unto the Lord according to the ordinance of the Passover and according to the manner thereof, so shall he do. Ye shall have one ordinance both for stranger and for him that is born in the land. I think that's what you was talking about, one ordinance. So how many ordinances do we have today? One. It's both for those in the church, and we'll say born in the land, okay? Well, what about those outside the church? Are they subject to a different ordinance than those that are in the church and already been born in the land? No, we're all subject to the same ordinance, aren't we? And that's what we're saying back then. They were all subject, as Brother Kahn said, to the same ordinance. So how would you know and understand the ordinance if it was not explained to you? And so that's where acceptance of the Jewish faith comes in. That's where today we would call that acceptance of the gospel, wouldn't we? Acceptance of the gospel. And so, it's kind of interesting. These people were born into a natural covenant with God. They were naturally born into it. But have you noticed, though, still, there's an entrance into the church? There was an entrance into physical Judaism, wasn't it? By those that were on the outside. So, kind of the same thing today. It's a parallel thought within all this. And so it says, like Brother Kahn said, in verse 49, one law shall be to him that is homeborn, and unto the stranger that sojourneth among you. So there's the one law again. Thus did the children of Israel, as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so did they. And so we find that Aaron and Moses delivered the instructions of God to the people. And there's a very important word in this. Notice what it says. So they did. Now, that three little words, like a lot of 3 or 4 little words. To do, to know and to do. Is that the same thing? No. To know it is one thing, to have the knowledge thereof, but just because you have a knowledge of it, that doesn't mean that you do it. That's a whole different aspect, isn't it? That's another way of saying you can have the knowledge and not have obedience, can't you? You got to do it.
That's what James said. He
Yeah.
said, be you doers of the word, not,
Not hearers only.
If you ain't a doer, in other words, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit and just say, if you're not a doer, then you must be one who is against it.
Right.
It's the same thing as leaving it out. In other words, it's disobedience not to do it.
Right.
In other words,
Right.
you're disobeying.
Yeah, and that's one of the fascinating things about being a doers of the word. And this is what the Apostle Paul said in Philippians chapter 4 about, having the peace of God being with you. How do we obtain that? You say, well, we obey the gospel. Well, that's true. But that's an elementary principle, isn't it? Let's look at some other principles that we grow into after we obey the gospel. Notice what he says here. Philippians 4 and verse 7. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. So, there's a lot of things going on in our life, other things that go on other than obeying the gospel. It's keeping oneself in the faith, isn't it?
I know this is off of the lesson, but I will make a comment on all those things that you just said there. You were in 2 Peter, wasn't you?
Well, I'm in Philippians chapter 4.
Oh, Philippians, yeah, okay. Well, yeah. If you think on these things, then you are feasting upon the Word of God. You are having a spiritual feast.
Exactly.
The same thing as if you was eating a good meal to satisfy your physical appetite. But thinking upon them things will satisfy your spiritual appetite.
Right, and that's what he's talking about here.
Yeah, that's
the
what
spiritual
I'm talking
appetite. But notice what he says here in verse 9. These things which ye have both learned. Oh, that's an interesting word.
Yeah.
Learn. It reminds me, and when I see the word learn in the Bible, it reminds me of Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 18. What did Isaiah tell Judah, Judah and Jerusalem to do? Learn to do well. The implication there is what? It's just not in man to do well, is it? He's a wanderer, isn't he? It's something you have to learn. Israel was going to have to learn to do what? To do well. Well, when you begin to learn, what does that require? This is a huge word, Ray Griffin. This is a huge word. You know what you have to learn? Watch it now. Discipline. That means you got to get in control of your heart and mind, Brother Colin, right? Learn to do well. So there's more to that word than just saying, well, I'm going to get educated in this knowledge. That's fine. You need to get all the education you can get in the knowledge of the Lord. But if you don't learn to apply it, then guess what it's done? Nothing. So notice what these things here says. These things which ye have both learned and received. Now, this received here is more than just taking the package. It's accepting what's in the package, isn't it? If you truly receive something, that means you accept the package in its entirety, don't you? Okay? There are people that accept the church. I know people that I've worked with and relatives and things that they accept the fact the church is a church. But what does it mean to them? They don't accept the teaching of the package, do they? But notice what he says here. These things which ye have learned, received, and heard, and seen in me. Uh-oh. Here we go again. Another spooky word. Do. There it is, Jeff. It's a plan of action, isn't it? You have to do these things to be accepted of God. And this really is the same thing that he's talking about here. They had to do these same things, didn't they? And it said that they did them, didn't they? They did them. Of course, we know once they get out in the wilderness, it's going to be a different story because how soon man forgets. There are people that have been baptized into the church, faithful members of the church, come and you thought, well, they're the pillar and rock and solid, and next thing you know, they're gone. It's kind of what happened to the children of Israel. They got out there, got to murmuring and complaining and all like that. It didn't go like they thought it was going to go. Well, they got dissatisfied, and that does happen. But right now, they did those things. And before we get into chapter 13, it's kind of interesting, verse 51. And it came to pass the selfsame day. That's when there was no leaven done in the bread. That's when they had to get ready. You're not going to have time to do all these things. You make the preparation. And when Pharaoh says go, then guess what you're to do? Go. There was no waiting. In other words, when Pharaoh said to go, you ought to do what? Obey.
And they went out in haste.
Didn't waste no time, did they?
Didn't waste no time.
Get out. And
Didn't have
that's-
time to do no kneading. They had to carry them kneading troughs with them.
Yeah, there was no time. Well, that tells us something today about getting out of bondage. The Bible talks about today as a day of accepted salvation. Well, this making haste should be a message to those that hear the gospel when it's preached, shouldn't it? Yeah. It's time to get out of Egyptian bondage. Make haste. Don't wait. Don't put it off. Don't let the devil continually get in control of your thoughts and your hearts, isn't that? And that's what he's talking about. And so it came to pass at the same day that the Lord did bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their armies. And of course, we know that in reference to verse 37 here, there was about 600,000 on foot that were men besides children. And so generally what you see that denoted, and we'll see it elsewhere, that 600,000 men generally denotes men of war. So this was quite a large group of people, wasn't it? We're not going to go back and do the numbers and things of that nature to come out. So there were a lot of people to come out of this. It's kind of interesting, and we talked about verse 40 and 41 last week, and we won't go back through that. But Paul seems to clear that up in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17, and we won't go back to all that again. But when you stop and look at it, from the time that Joseph, at 17 years old, went down into Egypt, until this day here, was about 248 years. Now, they were only in bondage from the time Jacob went down. Joseph was there about 23 to 25 years earlier than Jacob came down. So he was about 40 years old or thereabouts when Jacob, his father, came down. So when you put that together, about 248 years, we'll just round it off, say 250 years for the sake of an argument, from the time of Joseph to that Exodus took place. Because we know that Jacob was about 130 years old when he went down, so you can just go back and backtrace it. We did a little bit of that. And these things are studied within themselves. We could spend a lot of class time and all on that, but you can refer back to the handout on that. Any of you brethren got a comment on chapter 12? Okay, we'll kind of move on into chapter 13, and we're going to have the consecration of the firstborn. And this is going to be done as a constant reminder or a memorial or a pledge of dedication for the whole nations to keep. It's a remembrance of the Paschal lamb, the firstborn Paschal lamb that was killed in Egypt among the children of Israel, and it's going to be a thing that they keep throughout. So, verse 1, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, sanctify unto me all the firstborn, whosoever openeth the womb according to the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. So the firstborn of man or beast belongs to the Lord. And what this is, once again, is a reminder of the things that went on into Egypt. We can look at it that it is mine, maybe in three distinct reasons. The first one is because Israel was God's firstborn, Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22. And this practice honored that fact. Second, because the firstborn was thought to be the best, and the best was always given to God. And thirdly, as a reminder to all generations of God, when God redeemed Israel, his firstborn, from Egypt. There again, it's a type of memorial. It is a constant reminder. Because how are people in the animal world and things like that, how do they come into the world? They are born. So every time a firstborn is born, you got to reminder of what happened, don't you? You gotta remember one thing too about all this. They didn't have a constant reminder in the written word, did they, yet? So how was it done?
This is the first month of a new year too. It's
Yep.
always in the
First month of the new year. Yep. First month of the new year, that's right. And it is mine. And something else that we're gonna see here is that this is to be taught, okay? I can't get around the importance of teaching. There's no way you can do that throughout the Bible, being taught. One generation being taught to another. I'm going to jump down to verse 8. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, This is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. So who are you going to tell it to? Your son. Well, what is your son? Your offspring. So that continues the thought of the teaching, doesn't it? As a matter of fact, the teaching of these things are going to be so important that Moses, when in the book of Deuteronomy, and I plan on getting there at some point in time, Daniel, if I can get out of Exodus, I plan on being in there sometime, I ain't going to say when. I done learned not to say when, okay? So anyway, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, notice the words of Moses to the children of Israel about those things that were given unto them. Okay? Beginning at verse 7. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. So when are we to teach? Looks like at all times, don't it? And I'm going to key in on the children, I'm going to get off the subject a little bit. You can trace what's going on within our culture and cultures of the world and society back to that one statement. I mean, it's really simple when you stop and look at it. It's the lack of teaching, isn't it? It's the lack of instruction, isn't it? And even, today, it's a repetitive process in the morning, in the afternoon, in the night, so on and so forth, because there are people that have instructed their kids, have raised their kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, but what happens a lot of times? There's a factor that we got to remember in all this. It's a factor that we got to remember as we go through Genesis and Exodus and Deuteronomy in the Bible. Very often we overlook there's one key factor and influence that we always have to keep in the back of our minds when we're talking about these things. The devil. The devil. He's out there. He's out there to pollute the source, isn't he? He's out there to cloud man's judgment, isn't he? And Jeff, unfortunately, he very good at what he do. You know that? So you cannot deny or hide or whatever the devil. His influence is there. You're going to see it here in this. You're still going to see it when Pharaoh's mind and heart changes. Why did it change? The influence of the devil. That influence is there. And so that's something that we have to be cognizant of as we study the Bible too, is the fact that what's going on here? Well, Genesis chapter 3:15 is what's going on here, where it talked about Jesus coming, and the devil was going to what? Bruise his heel. He thought he had him there, didn't he? There on the cross when he went in the tomb. But Jesus carried out a resounding blow on the head of the serpent, didn't he? That's what's going on here. So you got to remember that in this fulfillment of things, his influence is still being felt. And it's being felt today. But that does not negate the importance of teaching. One of the things when somebody is taught and all in that, there's something that they can never say to you. You know what that is? You didn't tell me. You didn't help me. Can't say that. Hey, you were told. decisions you make sometimes rest on your shoulders. That's just life. People have a lot of times and dealing with, and I know in my generation, we were kind of hard to deal with in a certain respect, Brother Con, because I come up in the 60s and early 70s. Well, you know what that's about if you go back and look at history, right? But at some point in time, you got to size things up, haven't you? You got to size them up and get on with life, And that's what, unfortunately, it's kind of the same thing that's going on today is at some point in time, it's going to be interesting when it happens. Folks going to have to size up, saddle up, and foot up, ain't they? But anyway, that's off on a tangent, a different story. The importance of teaching is still there. And so Moses said unto the people, remember this day, here we go, Moses is teaching them, remember this day in which ye came out from Egypt, out of the house of bondage. For by strength of the hand of the Lord brought you out from this place, that there should be no leavened bread be eaten. So here we find that it is going to signify that by whose hand were you brought out? You were brought out of Egypt by the hand of the Lord. He brought you out of that place. Moses could have said, look what I done. Aaron could have said, hey, look like we done. We want a trophy for this, man. Look at here. We defeated Egypt. Pharaoh 0, us 1. No, that's man getting the glory. That's man's thoughts behind all this. Moses maybe said to Aaron, if I pull this off, I may get another star on my college, I'll be a 4-star general instead of a 3. That's the way man thinks it. But no, God done this. It was by the power of God that this was done, not by man. And when you study it and you go out and look at what the different scholars say about it, what some of the anthropologists say about it, the different ones that study that period of time, it's still fascinating to them. A lot of times, when they write about it, they want to try to explain it away by some earthly phenomenon. And I'm not saying God did not use an earthly phenomenon in some manner, because God uses nature to carry out his will. But the bottom line is you can't deny that it happened. Okay? You can't deny that it happened. Every once in a while still, they over there digging around the Red Sea, up on the northern part of it. Guess what they still find buried when the tide subsides and all like that, and they out there digging and all. What all these chariots doing buried under all this sand and silt? What's all these helmets, these Egyptian helmets doing buried under this sand and silt out here in the middle of this water? Now, you can try to loophole it, but you can't deny it. It happened. And therein lies the problem with man a lot of times. He tries to figure out a way to deny it happening, and the more he writes about it and the more he studies it, well, you can't deny it happened. It's there. It was real. And so we find that this is the power of God. And, all they're doing is they're not, the Bible doesn't need anything to stand on its own, but really what all that does to an earthly mind, it should remove doubt, shouldn't it? Because here's solid confirmation if you're looking at the flesh, that these things happen by the power of God. Here, I think it was last year, Peggy and I was watching some things on television, and it had to do with the Dead Sea and the location of the Dead Sea and the destruction of the 5 cities there in the well-watered plains of Jordan, which, we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, but there was Zoar and 2 others, that was also there that we know about. And one of the things that's real fascinating about it as they begin to study some of the remains that was there and some of the things that were still present there around in that area, the fire that God used is still fascinating unto them, because there's really no solid explanation for it. But it's there. The ashes, when they study it, the composition of them and all this, and I realized that part of that too had the tar mines or over there and stuff like that. But you can't deny it was from God. destroyed the place. It's a unique, very unique type of ash and composite that was left. Where'd it come from? And as a side note on all that, when the German army was over in that area operating during World War II, there was one area that they went around because they didn't want nothing to do with it. You know what that was? The Dead Sea. It's kind of interesting. They didn't go over and mess around. You know, of course, to man, it was probably more of a taboo thing, right? But
I didn't quite hear what you said.
I said,
Something about World War II?
yeah, the German army, when they were operating over there in the Middle East, you know, they wound up over there, and I think Patton, Rommel chased him all over Egypt, Algeria. But when you back up and you go down, that when they were operating over there, that was one place that historians say they went around, was over in that area of the Dead Sea. They wouldn't go in there and do any type of operating anything. And we know that man looks at that maybe from a taboo standpoint, but maybe there's a message there, you know, that sometimes people recognize things they don't like to admit, you know. So anyway, that's just a side note. It was really interesting about all that. Anyway, so this is going to be a reminder, and of course, the unleavened bread we talked about over here in chapter 12 has to do with taking out that bad influence, you know. The unleavenedness, you know, it doesn't take much of a bad influence to corrupt something, does it? It doesn't take but a little bit of leaven in the bread to make it what? Right. Well, that's that influence. And I think we talked about what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. May have brought it up like this, that if I told you to be a new lump, you would think I was insulting you, wouldn't you? Well, you know, come to find out, I won't be insulting you, I'll be encouraging you, because that's what the Bible says. To be a new lump. To purge out that old leaven. Notice what he says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. Purge out that old leaven, or that old influence, this is a spiritual cleansing, that ye may be a new what? A new lump. So if I say, Brother Con, that person needs to be a new lump, am I being insulted? Not really, I'm just quoting scripture. Be a new lump, as ye are now unleavened, or the worldly influence has been removed from you. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Now there it gets back to Christ being our Passover. We've been talking about that. And we're going to do our Passover today, aren't we? So anyway, we talked about that. And Brother Con, you brought up about this day came you out in the month of Abib, and that's going to be their designated, that's their new beginning, wasn't it? Their new beginning. And it shall come to pass when the Lord shall bring thee into the land of the Canaanite, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he sware unto thy fathers to give thee, a land flowing with milk and honey, that ye shall keep this service in this month. So that was the month it was to be kept, even when you go into this land that was promised to you aforetime. So this was going to be a strict ordinance that they were to keep as a reminder of what happened there in Egypt and the coming out. So, with that being said, do we see this symbolically today as the same thing? Every first day of the week, what do we do? And what do we say most of the time at the table? Well, it says it on the front. This do in remembrance of me. This is a reminder of what the Passover lamb has done. The Passover lamb has brought us out of Egyptian bondage. That's another way of saying the Passover lamb today, Jesus provided the way to bring us out of the world, didn't he? Sure it is. It's the same thought pattern that's used. It's kind of interesting too. What do we use? Unleavened bread. Why no leaven in the bread? Influence. You know, to them, this is a picture or type of influence of the world. There's no worldly influence in this. The same way with the fruit of the vine. the blood of Christ. There's no influence in this, is there? We're talking about worldly influence. And so you see the same thought in mind. And, and it's kind of interesting how, and I think Reed brought maybe a series of lessons on this a while back, maybe a couple of years ago, about how the mind and heart of God really haven't changed. We have it in the flesh in the Old Testament, but now we have it in the Spirit in the New Testament. And the theme from Genesis to Revelation runs red, doesn't it? It sure does. So, anyway, they're to keep this 7 days shall thou eat unleavened bread, and in the seventh day shall be a feast unto the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days, and there shall be no unleavened bread be seen with thee. Neither shall there be any leaven seen with thee in all thy quarters. He wanted complete purification is the whole point here. Okay? He wanted it completely out. So today when we say there should be no unleavened bread within our lives as a Christian, what does that mean? That means its influence should be put out altogether. It shouldn't be in any quarter, should it? And we know quarter has to denote dwelling, doesn't it? You can have evil influence in your house, can't you? But it's to be put out. Those things are to be put out. Those things are to be controlled by us. And thou shalt show, verse 8, and thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. Which he did unto me. That's personal. That's individual. He didn't say unto Israel, did he? What did the Lord do for us collectively as the church? He died for us, didn't he? But now when we bring it down on the individual basis, it's individuals that comprise what? The church. So really, when we're talking, we should say, look what the Lord did for me. So he's really bringing it down on an individual basis. Collectively, you're Israel.
It's totally personal.
Totally personal. That's where he's going with it.
Yeah.
Totally personal. It sure is. And thou shalt show thy son in that day, saying, this is done because of that which the Lord did unto me when I came forward out of Egypt. Why you remember the church? Because of what the Lord did for me when I was in bondage. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? To make that statement. It sounds kind of strange, doesn't it? But it's true, isn't it? We're members of the church because of what the Lord did for us while we was in bondage. This is Romans chapter 5, okay? And I'm not going to get into it because I think it's going to be in my lesson this morning. I'm supposed to speak this morning, so I won't get into that too much. But that is Romans chapter 5 thought. That while we were yet sinners, Christ did what? He died for us, didn't he? He died for us. And I'm going to stop right there at verse 8, and we'll get ready for the worship service here in just a minute.